Just a very brief word of introduction to this panel, and then I'll introduce the first paper. I thought last night's keynote address by Dr. Khan was very stimulating, and because it began with an engagement of the very theme of this panel, thinking about how do our definitions of genocide impact the kind of questions that we ask and the kind of insights that we try to glean from historical sources, or as we're trying to understand other events of mass atrocity or mass murder. Is the Holocaust implicit in the UN's definition of genocide, which was adopted in the wake of the Holocaust? The three papers that we'll be hearing this afternoon will help us will give us some resources for thinking about how do we investigate, reflect upon, engage different occurrences of mass atrocity, mass violence, and different occasions of genocide. Professor Barlow der Mugrdechian comes to us from Fresno State University, where he's the coordinator of the Armenian Studies program and the director of the Center for Armenian Studies. His wide range of scholarly interests are reflected in his many publications. His most recent books are two edited volumes. One, Between Paris and Fresno, is a festschrift collection in honor of Cichopek-Gajraj, and his most recent is titled David of Sassoon, Critical Essays on the Armenian Epic, which he co-edited with Cichopek-Gajraj. His paper this afternoon is titled Comparative Aspects of a Multi-Dimensional Genocide, the Armenian Genocide. Professor, we're very pleased to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for bringing together such a wide-ranging group of people. And as was said just a moment ago, Dr. Akcham's opening lecture, I think, set the tone for our conference. So today I'm going to present a PowerPoint presentation on the comparative aspects of the multidimensional genocide, the Armenian Genocide. And what I've chosen to do is to choose what I think are 5 key issues or key areas of the Armenian Genocide, and then use those for you to think about how those could be used in a comparative way with genocides of the 20th century. And I'll make some comments as I go along, but in general, it's going to be an overview of the Armenian Genocide from the perspective, though, of the key issues that are taking place. The Armenian Genocide is not just one event, it's a series of events which constitutes the period of time between early 1915 and 1923, and which resulted in the death of over 1.5 million Armenians and left the homeland of the Armenians devoid of Armenians. I think this is one area where we don't talk much about, but this was the homeland of the Armenians, and Armenians have been living in this area of Western Asia or Eastern Anatolia since at least the 7th century BC, when the word Armenia first appears in Persian sources. These are the 5 areas that I will be talking about today. First is the targeting of elite elements of society. Number 2 is the policy of mass murder through deportation and assimilation through forced conversion. And I think that overlaps already with what Dr. Akcham was looking at in terms of some of the underdeveloped areas or understudied areas in the Armenian Genocide. Laws as fictive cover for genocide. So I'll bring a couple of examples of laws in that area. Economic expropriation of property and other forms of wealth, and then cultural genocide through the process of destruction or conversion of monuments. So these are the 5 areas that are the multidimensional areas of the genocide, and we can look at them through the comparative aspect. Just a little bit of the history of the Armenian Genocide. So on the map you see what is today in green, modern Turkey. The red outline that says historic Armenia roughly corresponds to an area where Armenians have lived, again, since at least the 8th century BC. Maps can tend to be very misleading because they're not absolutes, and there are many different Armenias in history because there were many different Armenian kingdoms which covered various areas. And the area of Cilicia, which is the area on the bottom, it's a smaller area in red, which was also an area of an Armenian kingdom between 1198 and 1375. And so Western Armenia was part of the Turkish Empire since the conquest of Sultan Selim the Grim in the 16th century, when the Ottoman Empire expanded to the east. The statistics, roughly, approximately 2,200,000 Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire prior to 1914. That gives you an idea. Again, the statistics are debatable, but that's not a debate that I want to get into. They are basically looking at, again, various statistics for the population, but it gives us a basis to start from. I think the next two maps kind of set the stage for the genocide and the results of the genocide. This first map shows the division of Armenians in the world, that is, where were Armenians living prior to World War I. And the darker areas, which say in the Russian Empire, on the right side of your map, are the areas which have the highest Armenian population. And you can see that 45.9% of Armenians lived in the Russian Empire. This map was courtesy of Robert Hewson, who has done a lot of work in cartography. And then you can see on the left side, where it says the population statistics, 45.4% of the Armenians in the world were living in the Ottoman Empire, and then only 8% were living somewhere else. Also on the map, in the area that's the Ottoman Empire, you can see the relative concentration of Armenians. And again, you can see that concentrations are highest in areas like Erzurum, Sebastia, and Kharpeg. Again, demographics is a huge issue because the very vilayet boundaries that we see, the borders that we see, were 1878 borders, which were actually created by Sultan Abdul Hamid II in order to diminish the number of Armenians in any one province. So this is pre-war, and then this is post-war. And you can just see the statistics that what was once 45.4% of the world's Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire. After 1926, it's down to only 4.3%. And then you can see that more than 40% now of Armenians have dispersed through immigration, forced immigration, deportation, and ultimately ending up in different areas of the world. So when we talk about the genocide, the impact of the genocide can be seen through these numbers. Ideology, I think, was an important underpinning for the Armenian Genocide, organized by the Committee of Union and Progress. We used the acronym CUP. An ideology which included Pan-Turkism, calling for a unified Turkish empire stretching to Central Asia. It's an expansionist ideology, an ideology which also called for assimilation into the Turkish cultural and linguistic and religious majority. The Armenian population of the eastern provinces constituted a significant obstacle to the achievement of the Pan-Turkic project. So when we look at some of the basic underlying causes of the genocide, one of them can be seen through the lens of ideology. And I think if you look at most genocides of the 20th century, there is a sort of underlying ideology to the perpetrators which forms their worldview and makes the target population the victim population, in this case also. These are some of the other major causes of the genocide. Loss of territory. The Ottoman Turkish Empire had been losing territory in the 18th century to ethnic rebellions such as the Serbs and the Greeks in the early 19th century. Perhaps fearing that the Armenians in the eastern provinces might be the next group that would seek either independence or in some way aid Russia. The area of Muslim refugees was spoken about by Dr. Akjam yesterday, but I think it's an extremely important area of the Armenian Genocide because these refugees had to be settled in some areas. And these eventually were resettled in the areas from which Armenians were deported. That constitutes a sort of a premeditated plan because the government had a very clear understanding of the number of refugees which were to be moved in, and to where they were to be moved, and how they were to be moved systematically. So that also is an indication of the underlying systematic nature of this Armenian genocide. And then the outbreak of World War I as a disastrous consequence on the Armenian population. Violence, mass violence, that is world wars or other kinds of violence, also can be covers for atrocities committed by states towards their own citizens, as we've seen in many examples of the 20th century. The United States Genocide Convention was spoken about also. Probably most of you are familiar with it. If we look at simply the articles, I think it does constitute, the Armenian genocide can be seen as constituting a genocide according to the 1948 definition. But of course, the word didn't exist, genocide did not exist, and the convention didn't exist in 1915. If you're going to be doing research on the Armenian genocide, you're going to be looking up under Armenian massacres, because that was the general term that was used in that period. Now let's look at the 5 areas that I earlier mentioned. So the first was the targeting of elites, Armenian elites. Generally speaking, April 24th is today considered the annual day of commemoration for the genocide, because more than 250 Armenians were arrested in the capital of Constantinople and were later deported in 2 convoys. Most were murdered within a very brief period. So these included a variety of people, elites within the capital. That meant also that these arrest lists had already been prepared and were simply implemented when the time was right. Members of parliament, lawyers, doctors, newspaper editors, political activists, and others. And also later in the genocide, Armenian leaders were also targeted in other cities. The policy of mass murder was the broader policy which was the major cause of the disaster. That is, Armenian soldiers had been drafted into the Ottoman army after the 1914 entrance of Ottoman Turkey to World War I. And then Armenian soldiers were almost immediately disarmed and put into labor battalions in February and March of 1915. And many died to exposure and massacre. Thus, the civilian Armenian population, when orders for deportation came out, were by and large left defenseless. So this was one major element of the genocide. And then, of course, the policy of deportation, where the civilian Armenian population, women, children, and the elderly, were forcibly ordered to leave their homes under the pretext of protecting them. That is, they were to be deported from areas that were in danger from war to areas where they would be protected. Most were marched for hundreds of miles to the death camps and concentration camps in the deserts of northern Syria and Iraq. That was also mentioned yesterday. However, Armenians were deported from all areas of the Ottoman Empire. And I think this is a key issue in the Armenian genocide, that if you look at it, it was the length and breadth of the Ottoman Empire from which Armenians were exiled or were deported. And therefore, the argument that that was being done for protection doesn't hold water when you're deporting them from areas which are far from the front. And finally, there was a special organization, the Teshkilat Masusa, which was organized in late 1914, which became the implementation arm for the Armenian genocide and the deportation. Many members of that special organization were prisoners who had been released from prison and were drafted into this special organization with the specific purpose of the massacres and deportations. Forced conversion was also something that was part of the Armenian genocide. Basically, I take this information from Professor Akcham's book on the Armenian deportations and the case of the conversions. And it was talked about yesterday, but just as one example from the town of Marzavan, where there were 13,000 Armenians, 1,500 converted, and the rest were deported. As was discussed yesterday, there were several stages and reversals in policy, in the policy of conversion. Sometimes it allowed Armenians to be saved, but then sometimes it didn't allow Armenians to be saved. However, Armenian women and children would be taken then into Turkish and Kurdish families and forcibly converted to Islam. This is part of the assimilation policy, not necessarily a religious policy, but a policy by which to forcibly convert Armenians to the Turkish or Kurdish families. The map, I think, is indicative for the genocide argument. I was mentioning earlier. It just gives you a very broad view of the Ottoman Empire and the routes for deportation. The larger circles represent the larger Armenian population centers. And then you can see that the thrust of the deportations is southward, down into the area of Aleppo, El Raqqa, and towards the northern part of Iraq. And on the bottom you see is sort of a half circle. That's the concentration camps at Deir Zor. And recently there have been several scholars who are doing quite a bit of work on the actual, looking at these camps and what was the policy of the government towards these camps, which were purported to be, at least initially, places for relocation from which Armenians would be returned, but actually ended up being death camps. Now the next set of graphic photos is from the collection of Armin Wegner, who was a medical officer in the German army and was able to take photographs during World War I, and his collection of documented photographs is one of the best documentation for the Armenian Genocide. And this, his collection is now at the Armenian National Institute in Washington, D.C., but you can find his photos online. They constitute, again, the documentation of the deportation process. Again, it's a very difficult process. It's a very violent process where these people Armenians were forced to walk for many months. And on a personal note, my family is from the northern part of what is historic Armenia, from an area called Tokat. And my grandmother and great-grandmother were survivors of the Armenian Genocide. They had ended up in Aleppo and then came to Beirut and finally to the United States. Now, technology, I think, is an important element also of the Armenian Genocide. The early use of technology to coordinate and systematically execute the Armenian Genocide. Because of the great distances in the Ottoman Empire, the use of the telegraph facilitated the coordination of communication between the capital and the provinces. Talat Pasha, who was the Minister of the Interior, was a telegraph operator. He personally often monitored what was taking place, and this provided the means to simultaneously coordinate plans for the Armenian Genocide. It brings to mind a question that I'm often asked in the classroom. Why didn't Armenians resist more in the Armenian Genocide? It's a complicated issue. There were several areas where Armenians were able to defend themselves against the Ottoman Turks, but in most cases, it happened so quickly and in such a coordinated manner that Armenians were left unable to defend themselves. And the usage of trains. So that, of course, sort of is a precursor to later genocides. And this is a photograph taken from the Historical Institute of the German Bank. There was the Baghdad to Berlin to Baghdad railway, which was being built by German companies. Most of the workers were actually Armenians, but they eventually were also deported over the protests of the Germans, because the people building those very railways were deported and eventually killed. It's amazing how much energy and how many resources the Turkish government put into the deportation in the midst of fighting the war. The series of fictive laws are a couple of laws which were passed basically to cover what had already taken place earlier. So the temporary law for deportations in May 27, but the deportations had already begun before, earlier in April. So it was basically used as a cover for, again, protecting the Armenians. More importantly, the Abandoned Properties Commission, which was established in June of 1915, which was provided important cover for the government to appropriate the properties of Armenians who had been killed or deported and who could therefore not claim their own properties. The economic dimensions, I think, are a huge aspect of the Armenian Genocide, and I think, again, Dr. Akjam's lecture yesterday pointed out some of the areas where more research needs to be done. Basically, all of the properties of the Armenians were liquidated and sold, often at a fraction of their value, but that enriched a whole class of people within Turkey, within each locality. And scholars such as Umit Kurt and Umit Uyur have done work and have shown in the confiscation of Armenian bank accounts. And I give one example. where close to 30,000 kilograms of gold was deposited by the Ottoman Turkish government in 1916 from Armenian bank accounts. I'm going to skip these. And now the final area I'm going to cover is just a little bit on the cultural destruction, and I'm just going to give you a few examples. There were approximately, according to the Armenian Church, some 2,850 Armenian churches and monasteries functioning in Ottoman Turkey prior to 1914. In many cases, of course, churches were simply abandoned and left to fall apart. But in this case, at Tekor, these are examples where it can be demonstrated that the Turkish government intentionally was destroying these churches. So you see the before and after in 1912 and in 2000. And also at the very famous monastery of Hıtzkom, the Beş Kilise, five churches you can see on the left. And then 1966, after demolition, eyewitnesses to those demolitions, that's the sources for the cultural destruction. Finally, I'm just going to end with some information about genocide memoirs. I think for those of you that are interested in learning more about the Armenian Genocide, it's often through the stories of survivors that we really understand the personal nature of this genocide. So I've given several of them here. Judgment and the Truth by Jernazian, The Death Marches by Derderian. Archival evidence I'm going to skip over, but I think it's important as living here in the United States that we also understand the extent to which the Armenian Genocide was documented in American diplomatic reports, primarily by Ambassador Morgenthau, who was based in Turkey, in Istanbul, and U.S. diplomat Louis Einstein, as well as consuls who were placed in all of the areas already in the genocide, especially Leslie Davis, also in Kharkiv. Finally, but I just want to show you the Armenian Martyrs Monument. So how do Armenians now look at the genocide? After 50 years, they built a monument in Soviet Armenia. Every year, the entire population visits the site. It's a holiday. When I travel with my students, this is a group of my students, we always travel to the Genocide Monument. They have recently renovated the entire complex. There is an Armenian Genocide Institute and Museum for the genocide. It's the best Armenian genocide museum in the world, the most complete. It's also a research institute. And finally, in California, there's an Armenian Genocide Monument, but there are Armenian Genocide monuments throughout the world. So my presentation today was intended to give you 5 basic areas of the Armenian Genocide, and then maybe in the question and answer period we can talk about some comparative aspects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next paper will come from Dr. Anna Cichopek-Gajraj, who is an assistant professor of East European Jewish history in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU. Her fields of expertise include modern East European Jewish history, the Holocaust and post-Holocaust studies, and the history of anti-Semitism, among others. Her new book, Beyond Violence, Jewish Survivors in Poland and Slovakia, from 1944 to 1948, was just published last year with Cambridge University Press. This book is a comparative study of Jewish and non-Jewish relations in Poland and Slovakia after the Second World War. The paper she is presenting today explores the theme of witness and witnessing and is titled Memory of the Shoah Zagłada in Post-War Poland.
Hello everyone, thank you so much, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm feeling very incompetent being here at the Armenian Genocide Conference, but what I'd like to do here is to present a case of genocide, of Jewish genocide in Poland. This panel calls for a comparative perspective in the Armenian genocide studies, and I cannot pretend that I can deliver one, that I can compare the Armenian genocide to other genocides like the Holocaust. What I can do is I can offer a few insights on the genocide of European Jews in Poland. So those of you who are well familiar with the Armenian case, that you can maybe draw your own comparative conclusions here after this panel. And just because it's a comparative panel, I'd like to say that we should not dismiss comparative perspective, as we often do, because we are very often very afraid of comparing two societies. It seems like we need to be very familiar with two cases, with two societies, to be able to effectively compare them. So we offered sham from comparison. But we shouldn't dismiss that for many reasons. For one, a comparative approach allows us to separate the important from the incidental. Second, comparison reveals which experiences are common and which are unique, which aspects of an event is common, which is unique. Third, it illuminates aspects of specific events and the circumstances surrounding those events which might remain obscure or ambiguous when examined in the context of a single event or a single nation state. And finally, what Susan Pedersen calls denormalizing, and Deborah Cohen and Maura O'Connor call the unsettling of perceived naturalness of the event. Probably this is one of the most significant contributions of a comparative approach to historical studies. So as you listen to my talk, I really hope that you can think about any such possible functions of comparison between what I'm going to talk about now and the Armenian case. So what I want to focus here is not really the history of the Holocaust or history of a Shoah, because I assume that most of you have basic knowledge. What I would like to talk about here is the witnessing of the Holocaust on a communal level in wartime Poland, in wartime occupied Poland, and the consequences of this witnessing of the Holocaust, very intimate, very close witnessing of the Holocaust, consequences of it after the war. So the story focuses on the relationship between mainly Polish-speaking, Catholic majority, local population, and Jewish victims, Jewish minority, the victims of a genocide in occupied Poland. And it asks the question of how the witnessing of this mass murder affected local communities, both during and after the war. So the focus of my research shifts from the victims to the witnesses of victimization. This research is only in its beginning stages, both in American academia and in Poland. We have some excellent studies by Michael Steinlauf, Jan Tomasz Gross, Rachel Brenner, Jan Grabowski, Barbara Engelking. I don't know, some of these names might be familiar. But this research is at its very, very beginning. I base my paper on this research and on my own research about post-war Poland and Slovakia. So here we don't have much time. So I want to just signal a few main aspects I would like us all to think about. Poland was the physical site of a Holocaust, what we call the Holocaust, the Shoah, Zagłada in Polish, genocide of approximately 5.8 million European Jews and 250,000 of Sinti and Roma, whom I include in the definition of a Holocaust. It happened here, physically here, in this territory. Poland, though Poland is not a fixed, solid category. This is a map. You can see the contours here. These contours of Poland, this is pre-war Poland, pre-World War II. But these borders shifted and changed many times from the early modern times due to partitions, creations of independent country, etc., etc. In this was a fluid, multicultural, multi-religious, multinational country. This is our site of a mass murder. Most ghettos were created in this site. And you can see the map. This is the map of ghettos in occupied Eastern Europe. This darker site, this is the so-called general government, which was the occupied territory, German occupied territory of pre-war Poland. Most ghettos were here. Death camps were here. So Nazis operated about 20,000 labor camps all over Europe. They operated hundreds of concentration camps and many transit camps, but they operated only 6 death camps. Only. In those 6 death camps, 3.3 million European Jews were killed. And as you can see, except for Auschwitz, which is just at the boundary, and Helmno, again, just at the boundary of general government, 4 of them are on the eastern boundaries here of a general government. Just in Treblinka, 1 million European Jews were killed. Most of Sinti and Roma and another 1 million of European Jews were killed in Auschwitz. Bełżec, more than 500,000, mainly Polish Jews were killed in this place, Sobibor and Majdanek. So these are the sites of a mass murder. And I can, after in questions and answers, we can talk about why there. Major reasons was logistics. This was the main center of Jewish life in Europe, so transport was easy and cheap. Railways were already in place during the Second World War, so Nazis used the already existing infrastructure. It was completely under the control of the occupiers, and it was eastern enough to kind of evade any control or monitoring, possible monitoring. These are deep forests, deep forests of eastern Poland. So the mass murder happened here physically, and this physical proximity turned Poland's population, who lived in those territories, into willing or unwilling witnesses, observers, participants, murderers, collaborators, variety of roles. Important note here, we are not talking about homogeneous populations, we are not talking about homogeneous Poles or homogeneous Jews. These are very, very highly diverse communities. We talk about intellectuals living here in Kraków or in Lublin. We talk about peasant population. We talked about the lower middle class, all spectrum. Polish Jews victims were also highly diverse, from highly assimilated people who identified themselves as Poles to Hasidim and Orthodox who didn't want to have anything to do with Polishness or Polish culture and language. So it's also extremely diverse population. All these peoples with such various backgrounds now found themselves in this new universe created by the Nazi occupiers, with new values, new hierarchies, and new policies, including the state-sanctioned genocide. So genocide happened here. Genocide happened near houses like this, villages like that, made of wood and covered with hay. This is a village near Brzezinka, near Auschwitz. This is a shtetl, a small town of less than 5,000 people. This is Białystok, a middle-sized town or city in Poland, and this is Warsaw. And in all these different sites, these were the places of deportation, of ghettoization, of killings, murders happening here. in the view, in the backyards of local population, of majority population. So depending where you lived, you had different experience of mass murder. Peasants living here near Auschwitz-Birkenau could smell burning bodies. There was no escape from that. People in Warsaw could see burning ghetto. There was no escaping from that. But there were some parts of Poland where you had limited exposure to mass murder. It really depended where you lived. My father's village, as you can hear, I'm from Poland. My father's village, my father was a kid, was 4-year-old. And really there was no Jewish population before the war in this village. But during the war, he remembers a small child, Jewish child, hiding in crops, in the fields. This was the experience of this community, knowing of this Jewish child hiding there. And then the community denounced this child to Gestapo, and the child was killed. Very intimate, very personal experience of mass murder. So I'm wondering, in the Armenian genocide, if you have this kind of studies on kind of local experience, local population, the victims of genocide. And here I would just like to give you a snapshot. This is maybe before that. This is from a small town of Szczebrzeszyn in eastern Poland. In the summer of 1942, so in the midst of mass deportations, this physician, Zygmunt Krukowski, writes, and I quote, so he witnessed, he saw it just on his street of his small town, Szczebrzeszyn. A few days ago in Józefów, which was a nearby town, the Germans began killing Jews. August 8, 11 a.m. In town, the atmosphere is tense. Last night, it was clear that Jewish lives are in jeopardy. In the morning, I left the hospital to try and find out what had happened. All Jews must report at 8 a.m. across from a Judenrat. They are allowed to take 15 pounds of baggage, food for 5 days, and 1,500 zloty per person. The mayor informed me that 2,000 Jews will be deported east to the Ukraine. That was a comment. They will be deported east to the Ukraine. Railroad workers said that a large train with 55 cars is ready at the station. So far, there are no volunteers, so the Germans began mass arrests. I asked the gendarme what would happen if the Jews did not show up. His answer was, we will kill them here. Without interruption, throughout the entire day, patrols of Gestapo, gendarmes, Sonderdienst, Blue Police, which was Polish police, along with the members of Judenrat and Jewish police, patrolled the city. They searched houses, including basements and attics. Any Jews that were found were moved to the marketplace. Most Jewish houses are empty now, so city personnel began removing the belongings, loaded everything onto horse-drawn wagons, took them for storage in warehouses around City Hall. Most of the Jews are still hiding. Some Poles are helping the Germans search for Jews. In town, the tension is growing. August 8, 9 p.m. Around 8 p.m., the Germans began moving the Jews from the marketplace. Some Jews attempted to escape, but the German police stopped them by shooting them. The shooting started a panic among the people standing near the streets. These are non-Jews. So everyone began running. Several hundred Jews were taken to the railroad station. So this is a first-hand account of a small town and the mass murder deportations happening in a small town. As you can see, varied levels of interaction, of sort of encounter with this, with a genocide on a micro level. So Polish intelligentsia, Krukowski, recorded the events of a day. He was upset. He was disturbed, he could not gain control of himself. Other curiosity, perhaps out of compassion, or perhaps out of satisfaction that Jews were being taken away. We don't know their emotions. We don't know what they were thinking. Still others, caught in the crossfire on the streets, were running for their lives in fear and panic. Railroad workers reported a train. The city mayor and city personnel, none of them Germans, but under German orders, managed the situation. Blue police, so Polish police, hand in hand with German and Jewish police, patrolled the city. And finally, some Poles were helping the Germans search for Jews. So there were multiple modes of, in which non-Jewish Poles witnessed the killing of their Jewish neighbors, from compassion to passivity to collaboration. And of course, property issue. Property issue which stood at the center. Let's imagine a small town like Mugrdechian, where we have a typical shtetl where 60% of more population is Jewish. They live mainly in the center of the town. Some have some valuables, some don't. After Jews are deported, local non-Jewish population move into these places. And that improves their status, material status considerably. These are very, very poor populations. All these crimes, when the war ended, all these crimes remained an often intimate knowledge of each community, smaller and larger community. In villages and small towns, people knew very well how their neighbors behaved under occupation. Who turned into banditry, who traded on black market, who had collaborated with Germans, who'd gone into forest, who had rescued or denounced their Jewish neighbors. People talked, and they talked a lot after the war, contrary to the common assumption that war activities were a taboo after the war. There was much talk, particularly in small villages. And I have some examples here, which I'm going to skip. Oftentimes, community knew who killed a neighbor, a Jewish neighbor, or who denounced a Jewish neighbor, but many communities kept it a secret for many, many years after the war. It was typical for these smaller, especially small villages. After the war, members of small communities like villages and small towns judged one another according to a communal hierarchy of values, in which collaboration with the Nazis was unacceptable and openly condemned, but all other types of behavior, although most repulsive, remained within limits of acceptability. This included actions or inaction against Jewish neighbors. Villagers knew perfectly that denouncing or killing Jews is morally wrong, but they were willing to justify those crimes by all kinds of extenuating circumstances. In their eyes, the Jews were doomed. Nothing could have been done to save them, to rescue them, and considering collective responsibility and death penalty for helping Jews, it was considered perfectly acceptable not to do anything to rescue. So imagine when survivors were coming back after the war to their communities, and how much problems, their presence suddenly challenged the community. Absence of Jews would have prevented any inquiries. What had happened during the war? What did you do? What did your neighbor do? But now survivors, a handful of survivors asked questions, and they really made the whole community, they forced communities to face the consequences of actions. And just the last paragraph to end. Famous Polish literary critic Kazimierz Wyka argued that the greatest damage that the Nazi occupation did to Poles as a community of citizens, a society, was to undermine the notion of morality in daily life. An erasure that would have dire consequences for decades after the war. The quote-unquote demoralization of society was not just rubbing off Germans present in Poland. It was a matter of survival. It was a result of survival outside the law and against the law of the occupier. The population under total German occupation learned how to survive and how to manage through stealing, killing, and any con possible. All behavior, even outside of morality, became normative as long as it secured survival. I would also add that 5 years of Nazi constant and toxic anti-Semitic propaganda and the very witnessing of death on daily basis, including witnessing of mass murder of Jewish neighbors, further undermined the notion of morality in daily life, in general, and in neighborly Jewish, non-Jewish relations in particular. The problem is that then under Soviet regime, these crimes and the memory of these crimes could not have really been challenged or faced or talked about. So only in the recent 20 years or so, we are finally trying to cope with the witnessing of a genocide. Thank you.
Our final paper for this panel comes from Dr. James Armenian, a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, who is an associate professor of American Indian Studies at Arizona State. His scholarly works have been published in numerous academic journals and books, including the book Native Historians Write Back, Decolonizing American Indian History, which he also co-edited. Dr. Armenian is a past president of the American Indian Studies Association and a feature writer of the National Museum of the American Indians Writer Series. He's also generously joining us in the midst of a sabbatical, which we very much appreciate. His paper today is titled U.S. Genocide, American Indian Experiences. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's good to see everyone here on a Sunday when we could be doing other things, but some of us take our work very seriously. And before I begin my presentation, I want to acknowledge the homeland of the people that we're in right now with our physical presence, and that's the Ottoman people. And I'm wearing this emblem, which was given to me by one of the Ottoman people, which is their maze, which is about the mysteries or the journeys of life, or however you want to refer to it. So, a place is very central to American Indian experiences. And the genocide that we'll talk about often involved the movement of peoples from their homelands. I forgot to load my PowerPoint. It's loaded, but to get to it, let me do that. Just close that.
Yeah, you're
Let me just pull this up.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a little different time here. But refer to these the UN Convention of some sort. That's what sabbatical does to you. PowerPoint presentations. This is the UN Convention that we've heard about on genocide. And we've heard references like last night during that wonderful talk and even today about how this is in some ways problematic. And from my experiences as a researcher, I find it problematic in that, Indians, we tend to view things in a holistic perspective. And all of these things are related. These 4 items, or these 5 items or criteria for genocide are related. For example, seriously causing bodily or mental harm. Well, down at the number E, it says forcibly taking children of a group to another group. Well, doesn't that cause mental harm? So that's what I'm talking about. It's difficult to separate these. Doesn't the killing of your people, your parents, doesn't that create harm? Yes, it does. So I argue that even though many people in this country deny that a Holocaust occurred of American Indians, indeed it did happen. Even today, we're seeing attempts to strip our textbooks of what will exist about Indians to include things that are only positive about the American experience. It's a whitewashing that's going on now. And I've been interviewed a couple times recently by Indian Country Today about this issue. And it's very troubling to us that what exists already is very superficial, and there are people in this country who are wanting to take all of that negative history, if you want to call it that, out of the textbooks. The reason behind the genocide of American Indians is easy to explain. It happened because of land. European colonizers wanted land. They wanted resources. And they had to deal with Indian people. So they used legal mechanisms to justify the extermination of Indian people. What I have up here is one of the Spanish documents or elements of genocide. And essentially what this requerimiento said is that if Indians did not submit to Spanish domination or control, then the Spanish had a right to kill them, to enslave them. So it'd be the Indians' fault and not that of the Spanish. The thing was is that oftentimes these were read in Latin and other languages because of the language barrier between Indians and other people. In that document and others of this of the time period until even today, we must be aware that there's a language of racism that is a part of the colonization of the Americas. And this language was designed to defame Indians, to cast them as savage, warlike, redskins, barbaric, backwards, stupid, unworthy, so forth and so on. And we even see that language in the Declaration of Independence written by the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, in which the use of the language of the imagery of the warlike savage was used to, one of the justifications to break away from the Spanish, the English crown. And the reason that this part is included in the Declaration of Independence was because the English crown attempted to stop English settlers from moving across Appalachian Mountains into Indian lands and creating massive amounts of warfare that the crown had to fund. And the American colonists thought this was somehow an infringement on the right to take lands that belonged to Indian peoples. Even the first President of the United States, of course, this language was deeply entrenched in the mindset of these people at the time. And when Washington used this metaphor of Indian as wolf, people at the time period he was talking about, this was common language that people understood. And here, Washington is actually advocating for a peaceful policy of expansion, because he says that once wars are fought and Indians are defeated, they'll come back to their homelands like a wolf would. So that's what this metaphor means. Well, although he wanted a peaceful policy of expansion, oftentimes it was not peaceful, and it was genocidal, whether intentional or not. Even the Supreme Court uses language of racism to justify such things as denying Indian ownership of the land. And infamous 1823 case, Chief Justice John Marshall used that language of racism to incorporate the doctrine of discovery into U.S. law. What does the Constitution say about Indians? Very little. The Commerce Clause says that Commerce has the power to regulate commerce with the states, the Indian tribes, and foreign nations. That's it. Pretty limited, right? So what Marshall and subsequent court decisions, as with other justices, they would use extra constitutional interpretations based upon the notion of Indian inferiority and white superiority to justify the imposition of doctrines of control on Indians that did not exist, such as plenary power. When 1886, the Supreme Court, in a decision called Kagama, said that Congress had plenary power over Indians. So let me get back to Marshall. So what he was doing was trying to diminish Indian sovereignty and property rights. And what this did was ultimately subject Indians to the complete control and domination of the U.S. government. But this is a unique relationship because the United States government also recognized Indians as nation-to-nation, on a nation-to-nation basis. And when we talk about Indian, we're not talking about one group, we're talking about many groups. Indians, when Columbus came to the Americas in 1492, were more diverse linguistically than the people of Europe. There was a great deal of cultural diversity. In what is now the United States, there were hundreds of different Indian nations living in distinct political and cultural entities. And this map is, I like to ask this question, what's wrong with this map? For one thing, it does not acknowledge Indian presence. What it does is it recognizes European claims to the Americas. Here's that line I was talking about a while ago that the British Crown put in place to try to stop wars. It's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. So back to Marshall. He said that with discovery, the independence of Indians was diminished, and that land title passed from the Indians to the discoverers. Why? Because they were fierce, warlike savages. And this was an aspect of international law. Well, this was international law being developed without Indian input. This international law was designed to promote colonial expansion. So after Marshall, did the language of racism stop being used by the Supreme Court? It even continues today. Here's a good example of a 1955 decision that had to do with the Alaska land case. And the court in this case denied the Teton peoples of southeastern Alaska ownership of land that was taken by the United States government and placed in the Tongass National Forest, which was very rich with minerals and other resources. So he uses that language about every schoolboy. I guess schoolgirls didn't know about this, just the schoolboys. That the savage tribes of this continent were deprived of their ancestral ranges. So he said this is common knowledge. So therefore, what's wrong with it? Indians are stupid. He said they ceded millions of acres of land for trinkets, which is nonsense. Well, in these treaty-making processes, which is a big part of this history, treaties bestowed certain rights upon Indians. There's other court cases that led to the political subjugation of Indians, cases handed down by John Marshall. In 1831, there's a case of Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. And This was a case that had to do with attempts of Georgia to extend its laws over Cherokee lands in Georgia. And what the court did was not to rule upon the merits of the Cherokees' case, but to decide whether the Cherokees could file suit in federal court against the state. And Marshall said, no, they cannot, because they're not foreign nations, but they're domestic dependent nations, whatever that is. I guess they're supposed to be dependent upon the United States. Living in a state of pupillage, meaning that they're inferior, in a relationship that resembles a guardian with his ward. So it's the guardian-ward relationship that says the United States is superior, Indians are childlike, and they need the protection of the United States. Well, do the chickens need protection from Colonel Sanders? Is a good question. Anyways, this is what the court was doing. This was the thinking of the time, and this was used to justify the genocide that was being committed against Indians. And science became involved. Samuel G. Morton, called the father of American physical anthropology, tried to put the stamp of scientific certainty on the notion that Caucasians were intellectually superior to all other peoples. And he was doing this by studying crania. So his book, Crania Americana, which was published in 1839, tried to make that argument. And he skewed his research. He manipulated what he did to come out with the notion that, or with not a notion, but with findings that white males had the largest heads, which therefore made them superior to others. So what about women? Are men intellectually superior to women? According to this, they are. But what was the purpose of this? You know, is to put in, is to rationalize the notion of women belong in the home. That blacks are only suited for slavery because they're intellectually inferior, and Indians don't have a right to the land because they don't know how to use it properly because of the lack of intelligence. So this is what he went on to say, you know, about Indians, about their mental facilities. As they mature and grow, they remain childlike. So this became an important part of that dialogue about Indians. And the imagery reflects that, of the warlike savage, you know, demonic redskins, the killers of innocent women. They had nothing better to do but go on their way to kill innocent women and children. Well, the thing was that they were defending their sovereignty, their lands, and their way of life. And warfare did occur. So these are the angelic whiteskins. I'm doing a play on the term redskins, the controversial football team name. You know, this is how white America saw themselves, pushing the savage Indians out of the way and making room for progress, you know, American superior civilization. So the taking of children. This was an important part of federal Indian policy. This happened within the context of boarding schools, reservation policy. Beginning in this actually began during the colonial period, but in the 1850s and onward, the federal government's solution for the so-called Indian problem was to place Indians on reservations where they would be assimilated. And this required the taking of children from their parents, from their religious leaders, from the comforts of the world they know, and putting them in distant boarding schools and dressing them like soldiers in uniforms, marching them around to and from class, making them obey the bells and whistles, things like that. And the philosophy was to kill the Indian, save the man. And that's commonly captured by Richard Henry Pratt. So these were some of the types of posters were in boarding schools, you know, to impose white American Christian values on Indian kids. so that they would not return to the blanket, but they would integrate into white society. Well, the thing was, at this time, white society did not want Indians, and many of them did return home. And rejection of, Indians, resistance is a big part of this history. Indians did resist. And in 1928, the federal government commissioned a report looking into the condition of Indians, and the report found that a lot of Indians did not want to assimilate. They wanted to maintain their ways. And the report goes on saying Indians cannot do that because it will vanish if they do. Also, during the reservation period, the U.S. government adopted what's called the Code of Indian Offenses. And these are just a couple of codes I'm going to put up here that outlawed certain types of religious ceremonies. And it did this by denigrating those by saying that they're nothing but savage worship. So people, if they participate in these dances, they could have their food cut off, they could be put in jail. And you have to keep in mind that why was that important about food being cut off is because U.S. expansion intentionally destroyed the economies of Indian people, leaving them at the mercy of the United States government. Another is seed medicine. These are doctors. And the same thing could happen if people were put in what to see a medicine man. Okay, physical genocide did occur also. I made a partial list of some of the acts of genocide, physical genocide that occurred. For example, in New Mexico in 1850, in the early 1540s, Spanish colonizers, well, they weren't colonizers, they were looking for gold, commanded by Coronado, looked at the Pueblos, and they slaughtered Pueblos who sought to defend their towns from demands for food, clothing, and women. So, rape was a big part of this process, along with the theft of resources that people needed to live. At Acoma Pueblo in 1599, the Spanish force killed over 800 Acoma people. Then in 1599. In 1623, Virginia colonists used poison and arms to kill about 250 Pamunkey Indians who were engaged in peace talks with the English. In California in 1846, Captain Fremont attacked the peaceful band of Indians. So in California, this is where probably the most overt acts of physical genocide occurred, where there were many massacres of people. Some groups were essentially wiped out of existence because of this genocide. Why? Because of land and because of desire to obtain gold. Also, what we're doing in American Indian Studies is we're looking at the impacts of historical trauma. This history impacts Indian people today. Now, I think we can explain a lot of the social problems facing our reservation people and our Indian population who lives in cities by looking at this history. So we are trying to find ways to have people to come to grips with this history and to be able to use that knowledge along with ceremony and other ways to try to address these problems. Thank you.
Thank you for these papers. I have some questions, but I imagine you all might have some questions too. So I'll let you all go first. I'll moderate the question or comment session, and we have, I think, about 15 to 20 minutes, so we have ample time. And you can go ahead first.
Yes, a question about the natives today. Reservation. Now, many people 101 freeway has a reservation on one side, Scottsdale on the other side. Nothing is covered, no news. Nobody knows anything about the Indian reservation. It's like people know more about Iraq than they know about the Indian reservation. I personally think it's intentionally done. If you have other explanation for that, please do. And I just want to ask that a lot of people say that money fixes a lot of issues, builds schools and this and that. How come all that money is pouring there? And I personally had experience with people when I went in there, and I cannot explain to you my pain, the condition that people live in. And it's like it's done on purpose, even today. What do you think about that?
That's a great question. And I do ask oftentimes my students, how many have you ever been on a reservation? And most of the Indian students will raise their hands, all of them will. But oftentimes the non-Indian students will not. So I said, well, how many of you have driven up the 101 or gone to Tucson on the I-10? They'll raise their hand. Well, did you know you went to a reservation? So they don't know this history. That's why I like to acknowledge whose land we're on when I speak. But this is a deliberate part of the American education system to, I think, deny the existence of Indian people. And to deny what happened to Indian people. And colonization, as I mentioned before, is the root cause of many of those social problems on our reservations today. And as you said, money will not cure it, but money is needed to help with some of those programs, because you need money to survive. So, with the Indian Gaming Act, and now people say when we talk about these issues, well, why are you crying about what happened? You've got all you Indians are Indian rich, are rich because of gambling. Well, very few Indians get money from gambling, and those that do is often very times a small amount. There are some who get a large amount of money, but most of us don't get anything from gambling. And that money is probably even can cause more problems as well. So, yeah, we need to, my view is that, the change needs to come from within the communities, and they need to work to overcome the destruction of their traditional ways of life, the destruction of their social mechanisms that ensured that people conform to the norms of society, their society.
Question for Dr. Mugrdechian. I read that in around 1918, the latter part of the war, the British, along with some Indian units like the 28th Light Cavalry, came up through into the Caucasus to fight against the Red Russians, supporting the White Russians. And there were apparently some Armenian units or militia groups or locals that fought with them against the Russians. Was there any action against the Ottomans in that area? And this is around the Kars area. And then after post-war, did this make an effect where the Russians were doing things against the Armenians in retaliation?
So was the original, what time period were you looking at?
This was like right at the end of, we're talking October
of 1918.
November 1918.
Well, I mean, at the end of the war, the armistice had taken place in 1918, so that was the end of the war. The only real Allied troops that came into the area were the British troops.
Right.
But I'm not really sure that Armenians would have been fighting at that time in that area. I'm not aware of that. Fighting in that area against the Russians.
It was in this Caucasus area.
Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of things. There was a Baku commune of communists in Baku, Armenian communists in 1918. So there's that. So I'm not giving you a great answer, but I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Thanks. Yes, in the front here, please.
Are there any organizations designed to rectify the situation with regard to the genocide?
It's for me?
Anybody?
Well, there are many in Polish case there are many grassroots organizations all across the country to bring reconciliation between Jewish communities all across the world and Polish non-Jewish population, and think through the history of a genocide in Poland and the role of Polish neighbors in the genocide. So we have plenty of these kind of associations, organizations. Sort of every city now in Poland and even small towns have these kind of. So this is on a local level, but at the same time we have initiatives from the public, from the governmental. So the government, the most recent, initiative which lasted for last 15 years, the Museum of Jewish History in Warsaw. This is part of more of a political initiative to bring that.
What about the Armenian Genocide? Are there any organizations designed to rectify that situation, to deal with the situation today?
Well, I think in the case of the Armenian Genocide, we start with denial. So the Turkish government, because today's Turkish government has a policy of denial of the genocide, it's difficult to bring that to any conclusion. In other words, to rectify it. If in the case of the Holocaust, at least the German government recognized what had taken place, and then there was restitution which was taking place. In the Armenian case, in the last few years, there have been a lot of discussions, and there's I think one today as well, in terms of legal avenues to explore. Do you try to go to the international court? Do you try to what avenues can you do to try to get restitution, or whatever means it is, whatever it means there are to solve the issue? And it hasn't been very successful. And the problem for Armenians was that immediately following the genocide and into World War I, and after the communists came into power, for Armenians within the Soviet Union, it was impossible to bring the issue of the genocide. So Soviet policy was not in favor of dealing with speaking about it. And you were talking about genocide, you're talking about world bodies like the United Nations. You have to have a nation that brings it forth. There was no Armenian nation. So I'm saying that there were some intrinsic problems in the Armenian case from the beginning, obstacles, which are very high obstacles to overcome. So today there have been some cases, for instance, in the New York life insurance case. So there have been some cases where Armenians have sued successfully the New York life insurance and other life insurance companies for assets lost in World War I. I mentioned a little bit about the economic dimensions of it. So in very small ways, there's been progress.
May I suggest that an organization be formed, or else you try to deal with an organization like the Anti-Defamation League to enlarge their area of operation so that this is brought to the attention of the public continuously and that we try to deal with it. I mean,
Thank you.
I'm not suggesting going to Turkey. Let's do it here.
That's a great suggestion. I mean, genocide education is something that has to be stronger in all areas. I mean, we're talking about the Indian genocide, we're talking about Holocaust and other genocides as well. It's amazing how many students in many areas of the United States would be totally unaware of an Armenian genocide. And I think that's unfortunate, but certainly a good suggestion.
For indigenous peoples, in 2007, the UN passed the United Nations Resolution on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is supposed to provide a framework, a legal framework for governments to, with indigenous populations to treat them. And it recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples to exist as distinct, separate communities. But the problem is that will nations change, especially when they want to continue to want Indian land and resources.
I saw a hand to my right on the before I asked the last question, and then I saw, I think, a hand in the back. So we'll go one and then two. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, please.
I'd like to throw this out to each of you and see what you think of my supposition. The reasons for the three genocides seem to be in contrast rather than in similarity. And I see the Holocaust, the reasons for the Holocaust being different from, not that it matters, genocide is genocide, but I just like your reaction to this. That the genocide for the Armenians was one of power by Turkey and the Islam Caliphate at the time, because there were Armenians who had gained elitist positions, and that is the same reason for the Indian genocide. It was power over the peoples, over the land. And the same was true in parts of Armenia, that they wanted their land, correct? But in the instance of the Jewish genocide, Hitler's first objective to starting World War II was to kill all the Jews. So it was pure anti-Semitism. It was because the Jews had obtained some power in Germany, maybe a little bit more in Poland, but it was different. The reasons. So I just like your reaction to what I'm saying. It doesn't change anything, but I wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I think there's differences, as you mentioned, because of Indians were viewed as separate nations, peoples of separate nations, who had land, who had different cultures, who had different languages. In some ways, this applies to the others who experienced genocide, but that's, I think, a distinction between the, at least in my understanding, the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust.
As for the Holocaust, I know that we have here also Holocaust scholars, so it seems to me now that there is a consensus in Holocaust scholarship that there was no master plan or no plan of genocide of Jews in 1939. So the claim that the war was started to kill East European Jews, many scholars would argue against that. And also the question of land is also actually present in Hitler's ideology, where when he thinks about the East, he thinks about space and race. So it's as much gaining space for Greater Germany, for German nation, as it is a racial war. So it's actually both. Yeah, but we can of course talk after.
So I would agree that there are probably unique elements to each, but if you look at some of the definitions of convention, and in particular I think in terms of ideology, so a way of looking at the groups that were targeted, whether by settlers or the governments, is similar. Transferring children and inflicting deportations, I know indigenous people have gone through that, the Jews went through that, Armenians went through that. So I think there are very close similarities in some areas, but there are clearly other areas where you could claim, not claim, but I think could demonstrate some uniqueness to it. But I think you have to look at it as similar types of events in the sense of as genocide under that broader rubric.
On the back row, please.
Thank you. Forgive my non-scholarly thought, but I want to ask, acceptance and restitution, I hear them paired quite often. Can a society move forward with acceptance? I don't know what form that would take without restitution. Do they both have to happen? Are there ways that a society can accept responsibility and bring about change without restitution? I don't. Does that question make sense?
I think in the case of the Armenian genocide, the issue becomes one of acceptance, but then acceptance requires, a cessation of other kinds of denial. So the denialist case in the Armenian case is one of erasure of memory. It's one of erasing the very existence of the Armenians. So until that would stop, even by today's government, than to just simply say, to have them accept it, that doesn't really change anything. The question of restitution to me is a secondary but important issue. I don't necessarily pair them, but there are clear cases, have been documented in many of the economic studies of the genocide, where wealth was expropriated illegally, and there are still many Armenians who have documents that can prove that. And so there needs to be a genuine feeling on the part of the Turkish government that they want to do a genuine restitution.
So the acceptance has to come from some sort of formal body that could speak for the nation, let's say, and that might open the gates to legal proceedings. Is that?
Well, it has to happen that way. For the Armenians, unfortunately, we're talking about a diaspora, so there are Armenians living outside of Armenia in a variety of countries. So there is, unfortunately, no one unified voice in that sense. I mean, I think all Armenians would start with the acceptance. And there may be some that wouldn't want to go further, but I think if you look at historical record, I think for Turkish society, it's going to be more beneficial to continue the process and to go beyond that.
Okay, for Indians, we often talk about reconciliation, and we don't talk about restitution too much. But we need to, before reconciliation to occur, I think that the government needs to return much of the land that we lost, because when our land was taken, it destroyed our futures, our ability to develop economically, or impaired it dramatically. Now, what we have mostly gaming in a lot of our reservations, but how far can that go? That's just a very narrow form of development. So we need a systemic change rather than just an apology or something like that.
And in Polish case, I think as in Turkish case, it matters more to societies there, to Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Hungarian, Romanian, than to Jewish second, third generation in diaspora. This is not so much the problem of Jewish survivors, it's the problem of these communities that now have to deal with admitting, I think, not so much restitution as admitting crimes, and then going from there toward reconciliation. So I don't see restitution as although it's an important element in this puzzle, but in my particular case, in Polish case, it seems like admitting crimes, admitting guilt.
There, I think this hand here, and then your question. Did you still have a question over here too?
Let me see if I can reform it. I was thinking we're stopping, so I'm kind of lost track.
Okay, so here, and I think these will have to be the last three questions.
Thank you. I was listening to the Polish, everything, the Polish and Polish case. I'm thinking about this, in the Armenian case, the Kurdish element of this, of the genocide story. So the third part, we think of also genocide as a two-party event, process. Those who perpetrated and those victims. But as your presentation shows, of course, many Poles and Ukrainians and French were eager and happy to denounce Jews, turn them over to the Germans. And in the Armenian case, much of the actual atrocities were committed by ethnic Kurds, not by Turks. And I'm just thinking, and I'm not sure whether there's any parallel with the American case, other than the attempts by the British or like the United States to divide and conquer different tribes. But I'm thinking about whether this is part of the reconciliation process should be a conversation involving those other sort of actors. And particularly in Armenian case, what is the stage of dialogue between Armenian and Kurdish, Armenians and Kurds? Is it comparable to what's happening in Jewish Polish or Jewish French dialogue?
Well, I think it's happening. It's happened more in the last 10 years than it has in the previous 100 years. I personally know of a couple of scholars now that are traveling to places like Diyarbakir and Tiflis and have engaged in conversations, formal conversations with Kurdish political figures, and also done research, very interestingly, in comparison to the Polish case, because it was communal violence in the Armenian case. It was often the person in the community that was doing the killing. And so today there are Kurds who acknowledge that their relatives, their grandparents, or some relative was involved in such action. That's partially is also a function of the Kurdish position within Turkey, as the Kurds were also a suppressed people. There was also massacres against Kurds by...
Comparable to that thing is fate of the Poles, too.
Right. Right. So, and because of the current political situation where many of the leaders, the political leaders in the eastern provinces of Turkey are Kurds, and they are against the Erdogan government. So that also is a function of what's happening. So what I'm saying is there's actually been no sort of formal, in the sense, because again we're talking about diaspora, so there are in certain individuals, a couple of institutions that are trying to engage in civil conversations and is to do some kind of discourse on it. And I think it's starting, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Your question.
Okay, hi. Thank you for all the work you do in combating societal amnesia with regards to genocidal studies. I wanted to ask about sort of the politics involved with genocide in academia. So, for example, like, do you notice any sort of political pressure in regards to the pursuit of the truth, with the Holocaust being so entangled with Israel-Palestine, for example, or if with the U.S. denial of the genocide perpetrated against indigenous populations being, while sort of acknowledging the Holocaust and Armenian genocide being a sort of externalization or outsourcing of responsibility. So I wanted to know your thoughts about that.
Thank you very much. It's a very difficult question. So I'm a junior scholar, and I'm trying to keep away from politics and not let politics. But yeah, it's present. I know it's present in campus. It has not been present in my classrooms. So as much as I attempt to make it relevant to my students who live in contemporary particular politics, I shy away from this kind of broader political discourse. I'm also very well aware that because of particular political environment, I have much more resources, I have much more opportunities to teach the Holocaust, I have much more, that's...
I think in the case of Armenians, in the case of the United States and Turkey, and especially in academic circles, there is still a denialist current. There are still scholars who tend to use an interpretation which says it's not genocide. That is something that's occurring, that also has official and unofficial Turkish government support, and also American support in American academics. So it's something that exists. As long as the denial exists on a state level, the Turkish government level, it will continue on a greater level in academics. So there are still plenty of areas in Armenian genocide studies that can be discussed. But again, the denialist literature is pretty powerful in the sense of trying to move people away from that argument, but it exists.
And I've always embraced political action. I consider myself an activist scholar, even when I was a graduate student. I even got threatened, I've never finished my PhD program if I didn't back down from affirmative action issue at UCLA, so I plowed ahead anyways. But we're working to try to get laws passed. The laws aren't necessarily always the best thing either, but because they're usually in the colonial framework. But I talked about some of the massacres that occurred. Army soldiers would decapitate Indians and send their skulls to the Army Medical Museum to study them to try to prove the superiority of the white race. That type of research was going on. So we got a law passed several years ago called the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act. We also fight for sacred sites protections, which is the ongoing religious freedom issue for American Indians. There's at Oak Flat now, between Superior and Globe, there's an encampment on that land that has to do with a land exchange and will that'll allow a copper mine to come in and destroy that Apache sacred site. So, many of us become involved in issues such as this because some of us pursued our education for this type of purpose.
I forgot my original question, but I'm came up with, are there any better practices coming out of Canada or Mexico or other places, particularly in dealing with Native peoples or Australia, that could be applied to the U.S. situation?
A few years ago, Australia court said that the Aboriginal peoples own the land, but I don't know what that means. I don't know what's come of that. I don't think too much. The natives of Canada are working hard to have the Canadian government implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's, especially with the tar sands situation, that has really become an issue. So, even though the UN DRIP does exist, and that acronym is terrible, DRIP. We want a downpouring of rights, not a drip. But anyways, in the United States, we may have a little better than other places like Mexico. Oftentimes, indigenous peoples are not recognized as distinct peoples. They don't have rights to subsurface mineral rights like we do in this country. So yeah, it's a very complex issue of relationships between indigenous peoples within individual countries.
Yes, go ahead.
I would like to take this opportunity to renew my suggestion that an organization be formed to deal with persecution universally and to have media representation so that this is exposed throughout the world, and an organization be formed which will deal with this at the United Nations, which was the real reason that was formed. Get in there and expose this internationally, worldwide. There are enough people interested, I think, to do it. And there'll be lots of money coming in behind it.
I was informed a few minutes ago that we had extra time because our presenters were more economical with their presentations than the parallel session. So we've got a couple more minutes. So if you've got a burning question, I see a hand up in the back. So we'll go ahead.
I'm just curious, you allow positions of academia to share this history. Do you feel that you're threatened in your positions from teaching this to generations as they are, going through your classrooms? Direction toward denial of any of these situations and tragedies is being directed at you to keep it to a minimum, or do you feel that in your positions that you've been able to share this history and the acceptance of that with your students in the positions that you have today?
I can say that I have not felt threatened, and I've been fully able to teach as much as I want. So at my institution where I'm at and where I've spoken, I have never felt that threat, although we've been to forums where there have been people denying it, and there's been panels and that kind of discourse, but never any threat.
I guess the greatest problem I faced was when I was in the School of Justice Studies and student evaluations. We talked about injustice in American society to a lot of students who wanted to be police officers, FBI agents, DEA agents. Somehow they had a different worldview. They would buy into the notion that people were inherently criminal, or they come from culturally deficient cultures that made them criminal, and they didn't want to look at the structural flaws of this country as a way to contextualize crime and mistreatment of peoples. So that's probably the greatest area I had, which could impact our tenure, as you went through the process of tenure. But I'm beyond that now. I'm getting close to retirement. I can care less.
I need to care.
Please do.
Before tenure. But no, it's, being a Holocaust scholar in the US today, we have so much support on all levels, both local and administrative and governmental level. So many resources and support. It's absolutely not the case. Of course, there is Holocaust denial here, but that's marginal. I've never encountered it in academia, but I know it's there.
Are there another question here?
Could you, Professor, write it in? Okay. It's a very complicated system of the reservation land lease. I think it's a patchwork. Most of the reservation, the land I'm talking about, is really leased to the government. Some have 100 years, I believe, and the Congress can take it away like that.
Actually,
Can you explain that?
actually, the Indian lands is owned by the federal government. It's being held in trust for Indian nations. But in practice, we pretty much have a say, but oftentimes certain actions have to be approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Department of the Interior. And that's the colonial structure that's in place. And with my land, my people, the Pawnees, once we own most of what's Nebraska and Kansas, now in Oklahoma, we own collectively about 500 acres. And we have pretty much control of whatever's on that land. But there's other lands that are allotted, we still own through allotments, but the land is so divided through individual ownership that it's hard to do anything with that land, those small pieces of land. It's complicated, the land issue. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, because I think some land have been, when you say it's owned by individuals, are those Native American individuals or?
On some reservations, the majority landowners are non-Indians because of the General Allotment Act of 1887. And others, non-Indians cannot own land. Like Salt River, the land was allotted to individual landowners, and Gila River, but non-Indians cannot own land there. But on other reservations, they can. So it's really a complex issue of Indian sovereignty and land rights.
Let's see, I saw two.
Go ahead.
Let's see, but there's someone here who hasn't asked a question yet. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 if we've got time.
Okay, all of the Armenians were deported to Eastern Northern Syria and Iraq. How common, if it was at all, how commonplace was any aid by Syrians and Iraqis to the Armenians? Are there any records of that?
Records of aid by Syrians and
Iraqis?
Yeah, so actually what happened is that many of the Armenians were resettled in Aleppo and in northern Iraq, and then actually the war ended before they had been completely annihilated. And so there's much documentation about how Arabs did actually help Armenians. So they gave them housing and food, and so did help. And many Armenians, up until just a few years ago in the Syrian civil war, there were over 150,000 Armenians in Syria. So it remained as one of the largest diaspora and Armenian communities, very, very important community in that area. And Iraq before the war also had a significant Armenian population, most of whom were survivors of the Armenian Genocide. So and of course the United States with Near East Relief and other organizations did a lot to alleviate in some way the plight of the refugees. The modern Republic of Armenia, or actually the Republic of Armenia in 1918, would not have probably survived without aid from the United States. So there was a network of aid to help.
I think I was told we had till 3, and I have 3.
You have 5 more minutes. Other panels a little bit.
We have 5 more minutes. Okay. So very good.
Thanks. Question for Hannah and Barlow and this is 21st century. We've seen what appears to be an upsurge in anti-Jewish feelings in Europe. And it seems like with Erdogan in Turkey that he's got this more nationalistic fervor, and so, and bringing in more of a Muslim state and such to a certain extent. What do you see happening in the 21st century? Are things getting worse? Or we got things going to get worse before they get better, or what do you predict?
So you're talking about within Turkey for Armenians that are
Turkey
living?
and within.
Well, I mean, in the case for the Armenians, it's a little bit of what Professor Akçam said yesterday. So if the educational system is teaching hatred and teaching anti-Armenian feelings, then that's not a good sign. The Armenian community already is, in a sense, besieged because of economic opportunities. So being an Armenian in Turkey can have negative consequences. There are many Armenians who are still afraid to really reveal their identity. These are part Armenians, maybe who have a grandmother that's Armenian. So until that entire environment begins to change, and in some ways it has changed. I mean, so we have to look at the one aspect that there has been some change from the Kemalist attitude, which was up until the Erdogan government came in, which was really to suppress everything and really is the anti-Armenian. Erdogan has allowed some activities. I mean, for instance, this year there will be April 24th genocide commemorations in Turkey, open, and with open society. So that would have been impossible 10 or 15 years ago. So there is some change taking place, but there's great concern because his policy in other ways has not deviated from the previous Turkish policy, and of course the issues of recognition of the genocide and what goes after.
When I was trained as historian, I was told not to think about the future and not to. I cannot really say anything about the future. But about Poland, Poland is a different case than France. So we don't see the same dynamic in places like Poland or Czech Republic as we see in France or Hungary. In Poland, actually, there are no armed guards in front of synagogues. There's no fear. There's a lot of going on as far as Jewish culture, as far as reconciliation. There is some upsurge. The most recent survey from 2 years ago showed a surge in religious, traditional anti-Jewish imagery. So more people all of a sudden believe in blood libel. There was a spike, but fewer people believe in conspiracy, in Jewish conspiracy, and all these modern anti-Semitic images. So I'm very optimistic. I believe that it also goes hand in hand with economy. Poland doesn't have immigration issue yet, as France has. Of course, anything might happen. But as of now, I'm optimistic about the Polish case, not the European case in general. Europe, every part of Europe has different issues, different problems, and we'll see.
Yes, but Native Americans, I want to find out more. Because there is nothing, really. There are no numbers. I know about the Holocaust. I know I'm Armenian. I know about Armenian genocide a lot. But I don't know much about the Native Americans, and that's what I want to find out. We live here, and we don't know anything. And the fact that I drive a lot, and I drive on that one, every time I drive, I look on this side and on that side, I say, what is this? You know, these people don't know anything about these people, and that bothers me. It seems strongly that something is keeping it that way, something very powerful. But what I want to know right now, do you have any numbers of how many people were killed, what tribes, and how?
In 1492, there were, this is the demographers' estimates of the indigenous population in the Americas varies. But some of the more recent scholarship says in what's now the United States, it was probably between 10 to 20 million people. And by 1900, that number had fell to 600. A lot of it was contributed to disease, but there were survivors. And people wanted to carry on the traditions. their way of life. They want to preserve their sovereignty, their cultures, their land base. And this is where the genocide happened. So a lot of scholars who are in denial say that because of this was a biological phenomenon that nearly wiped out the Indian population, there was no genocide. Well, that's a very wrong perspective because those people do not look at what happened to the survivors.
Thank you.
My own people, though, we once said we were once as populous as the buffalo on the Great Plains, which is a lot of buffalo, and the stars in heaven. But by 1900, our population had fallen to 650 people. We were nearly wiped out. And a lot of it had to do with the reservation period because once we were put on reservations, new diseases came about, man-made diseases, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, caused by the changes of diets and by the changes of our lifestyles, and we could not address those problems because oftentimes the medicine men were under attack, and the federal government did not provide enough resources to address the food and the health needs of the people, and the housing needs.
So we need to wrap up now? Okay. Thank you so much for the extra questions. Thank you to our panelists for their fantastic presentations and also the 20 extra minutes of questions. So would you please join me in